Stop. Before you think of Henry Ford, you think of the Model T. You think of the assembly line. You think of cheap, ubiquitous mobility. But I'm going to tell you a chilling secret about the man who put America on wheels. The machine he truly wanted to perfect, the one he spent millions trying to control, wasn't made of steel and rubber. It was flesh and blood. It was you. Every great industrial revolution has a dark, hidden cost, and the darkest part of Ford's revolution wasn't the dehumanizing grind of the line. It was the audacious, unprecedented attempt to colonize the worker's mind, their home, their very soul. Imagine this. It is January 1914. The average industrial wage is around $2.40 a day. You are grinding your life away in the deafening, soul-crushing chaos of the Highland Park factory. This hard, brutal, monotonous work. The kind that makes men walk off the job at record rates. Ford's turnover is astronomical. He hires 50,000 men a year just to keep 14,000 jobs filled. Productivity is hemorrhaging. Then, the announcement. A single, mind-bending decree that echoes across the industrial world and alters the DNA of capitalism forever. The $5 day. Ford would double, sometimes even triple, the wages of his workers. $5 a day. Overnight, Ford workers become the envy of the world, the kings of the labor market. A living myth is born. People rush Detroit, clawing for a job, forming lines thousands deep, stretching for miles in the freezing cold. This wasn't just a pay raise. It was a psychological detonation, a seismic shift in how a worker valued his time, his effort, his life. A massive, shimmering golden lure. But here is the terrifying truth. The secret Ford didn't broadcast. This revolutionary wage wasn't a gift. It was a contract, a gilded cage, a control mechanism so sophisticated and intrusive that it would make modern surveillance seem quaint. Ford wasn't buying your time in the factory. He was buying your life outside of it. The $5 was only half the deal. The other half was conditional, hidden in the fine print of an unspoken, almost totalitarian bargain. The full $5, the life-changing, house-buying, future-securing amount, was reserved only for those employees deemed worthy. And who decided worthiness? Enter the true, disturbing innovation of Henry Ford's empire, the unseen eye that watched you sleep, the Ford Sociological Department. This wasn't HR. This was a moral police force, a social engineering unit led by the fearsome John R. Lee and staffed by over 100 investigators, speaking dozens of languages, ready to infiltrate every aspect of your private existence. They were not there to help you build a better car. They were there to build a better man. Specifically, a man Henry Ford deemed efficient, predictable, and utterly subservient to the needs of the assembly line. They didn't check your attendance record. They checked your soul. This department was the engine of Ford's human control experiment, turning the workplace into a disciplinary institution. They wanted to sanitize the lives of the workers, eliminate the disruptive elements of modern, immigrant, working-class life, and mold them into the perfect cogs for his perfect machine. Think about the sheer audacity of this. A private corporation telling you what furniture you could own, how clean your kitchen must be, who you could live with, and whether your children were earning money. This wasn't philanthropy. It was social control powered by the lure of obscene wealth. The investigators, often referred to as snoopers, fanned out across Detroit's sprawling immigrant neighborhoods, their job terrifyingly simple: to determine if an employee was living an approved life. If you failed to meet the department's stringent puritanical standards, if you gambled, if you drank too much, if you sent money back to your family overseas, a massive financial drain in Ford's view, if you took in boarders, or if your wife wasn't maintaining an immaculate home, the $5 would be instantly and cruelly cut down to the standard rate. The threat of losing that incredible wage, the difference between subsistence and security, was the most powerful lever of social conformity ever devised by a private enterprise. It wasn't about factory discipline. It was about existential compliance. The psychological pressure must have been paralyzing. Every choice you made, every quiet moment in your own home, was now potentially observed, judged, and financially penalized. The Sociological Department became the shadow of the assembly line, a chilling, invisible extension of the factory floor into the most intimate spaces of the worker's life. This incredible pay raise, the celebrated $5 day, was not freedom. It was a leash subtly tightening, ensuring that the worker, now dependent on that golden wage, would conform entirely to the rigid, idiosyncratic moral code of Henry Ford. The story doesn't end with a clean house and a sober worker, though. The Sociological Department's reach grew, its targets shifted, and its methods became darker and more intrusive as Ford's own paranoia and authoritarian tendencies intensified. The first successful phase, the initial shock and the willing compliance of the desperate masses, was complete. But the resistance, the hidden acts of defiance, and the ultimate failure of Ford to truly conquer the human spirit were still to come. The grand experiment in human engineering had begun, but the ultimate cost and the inevitable backlash were just gathering strength in the shadows of the Model T. You are now inside the system. You have accepted the bargain. But as the winter of 1914 turns into spring, you realize that the $5 day is not a wage. It is a leash that is getting shorter by the hour. The men in the suits, the investigators from the Sociological Department, are no longer just visitors. They are the architects of your new reality. Let's go deeper into the psychological machinery, because what happened next wasn't just surveillance. It was a systematic attempt to erase your identity and replace it with something Henry Ford found more pleasing. Imagine the sheer logistical nightmare of this operation. Ford employed thousands of immigrants, Poles, Russians, Italians, Hungarians, men who spoke little English and held on to their old-world customs. To Henry Ford, these customs were inefficiencies. They were bugs in the software of humanity that needed to be patched out. So, the Sociological Department launched one of the most bizarre and unnerving educational programs in history, the Ford English School. But this wasn't just a language class. It was a factory for the mind. Attendance was mandatory for non-English speakers. If you refused to go, you didn't just fail a class. You lost your eligibility for the $5 day. You were laid off. The curriculum was designed to instill American values, specifically, Ford's version of American values: obedience, punctuality, hygiene, and absolute loyalty to the company. The teachers were Ford employees, the textbooks were written by Ford executives, and the lessons were drills in conformity. But the true peak of this psychological theater, the moment that looks more like a scene from a dystopian cult film than a car company history, was the graduation ceremony. It was called the melting pot. Picture this vividly, because it actually happened on stage in Detroit. A massive, painted wooden pot, a cauldron huge enough to hold human beings, was placed in the center of the stage. On one side, a staircase led up to the rim. On the other, a slide led down. The unprocessed immigrant workers, dressed in their traditional ethnic clothing, their folk costumes, their cultural heritage, would walk up the stairs singing their native songs. They would carry signs labeling them as Polak or Hunky, using the slurs of the time to define their past selves. Then, right in front of the cheering audience of executives, they would step into the giant pot and disappear. The symbolism was not subtle. It was violent in its erasure. Inside the pot, hidden from view, they would frantically strip off their clothes, the clothes of their ancestors, the clothes of their identity. And then, moments later, they would emerge from the other side. But they were changed. They walked out wearing identical, sharp American suits, waving small American flags, singing the national anthem. They had been processed. They were no longer Italian or Polish. They were Ford men. It was a public ritual of rebirth, a theatrical declaration that your past was dead and your future belonged to the company. This creates a powerful psychological split in the worker's mind. The old self is shameful, inefficient, and poor. The new self is American, wealthy, and obedient to Ford. But the control didn't stop at the stage. It followed you home, into your bedroom, into your bank account. The advisors from the department began to enforce a code of conduct that was obsessively detailed. They didn't just check if your house was clean. They checked how you spent your money. Ford despised debt, and he despised frivolous spending. If an investigator found that you had bought something they deemed unnecessary, a fancy rug, foreign food, or heaven forbid, alcohol, you were disqualified. Your pay was cut. You were put on a probation list. Imagine the anxiety of making a purchase at a store, wondering if the receipt would be the evidence that destroys your family's financial security. They created a culture of total transparency where privacy was equated with secrecy, and secrecy was equated with guilt. They even monitored your marital relations. If a man was having trouble with his wife, the Sociological Department would intervene, mediating arguments, threatening the husband if he wasn't treating her properly, or threatening the wife if she wasn't maintaining the home to Ford's standards. They were the judge, jury, and executioner of your domestic life. Single men were viewed with deep suspicion. Ford wanted married men. They were more stable, more dependent on the wage, easier to control. So, if you were a bachelor, the pressure to find a wife and settle down wasn't just social, it was economic. The department also waged a war on boarders. In immigrant communities, it was common for families to rent out a room to a single male worker to make extra money. Ford hated this. He believed it led to overcrowding and immorality. So he banned it. If you took in a boarder to help pay rent, you lost your $5 status. You had to choose: help your community and friends, or obey the company and get rich. It isolated the nuclear family, breaking the communal bonds of the immigrant neighborhoods, making the worker solely dependent on the corporation. The Ford Guide, a book given to employees, contained explicit instructions on everything from how to bathe to how to sleep with windows open for fresh air. It was a total colonization of the lifestyle, and for a while it worked. The turnover rate plummeted. The workers, terrified of losing the golden wage, complied. They scrubbed their floors, they learned English, they kicked out their boarders, and they smiled for the investigators. But beneath the surface, a deep, simmering resentment was building. You can force a man to wear a suit, you can force him to wave a flag, and you can bribe him to keep his house clean, but you cannot buy his loyalty forever. The human mind is not an engine. It cannot be tuned to perfection without eventually breaking. The cracks in the system were starting to show, and the Ford man, this perfect creation of social engineering, was about to face a test that no amount of money could solve. The world outside the factory was changing. The war in Europe was looming, and the very tools Ford used to control his men, surveillance and paternalism, were about to turn into weapons of paranoia as the era of the naive experiment ended and the era of the hard crackdown began. The suit and the clean house were just the admission price. Now that Henry Ford owned your soul, he was ready to extract every ounce of energy from your body. Forget the Sociological Department for a moment. They were the soft gloves. Now we enter the era of the iron fist. We are moving from the neighborhood to the cathedral of industry, the most terrifying and magnificent industrial monster ever constructed, the River Rouge complex. If Highland Park was a factory, the Rouge was a country, 1.5 miles wide, a mile long, with 93 buildings and over 100,000 men working in a synchronized frenzy. It was a self-contained mechanical universe. Iron ore went in one end, and a finished car came out the other every 49 seconds. But inside this miracle of engineering, the human being was being systematically reduced to a biological servomechanism. The $5 day had done its job. It trapped you. Now Ford tightened the screws. The phenomenon was called the speed-up. It started slowly, almost imperceptibly. The assembly line, that relentless, moving rubber and steel snake, began to crawl just a fraction faster. Maybe you tightened a bolt in 10 seconds yesterday. Today you have 9. Tomorrow 8. The line never stopped. It never waited. It was a god that demanded constant sacrifice. The psychological pressure of the line was unlike anything humans had faced before. In the old days, a craftsman controlled his pace. Here, the machine controlled you. You couldn't scratch your nose. You couldn't adjust your hat. You couldn't step away to use the bathroom without a relief man jumping into your spot instantly. Because if you missed a single beat, the whole line would jam, costing thousands of dollars a minute. And if you caused a jam, you were fired before the belt even stopped moving. The managers, armed with stopwatches, stood over you like vultures, analyzing every twitch of your muscle. This was Taylorism taken to its psychotic extreme. They calculated the exact second it took to lift a fender, to turn a screw, to wipe a windshield. If you were too slow, you were out. If you were too fast, they just sped up the line to match you. It was a game you could not win. The factory floor became a place of bizarre, enforced silence. Ford hated talk. He believed talking reduced efficiency. So, a new rule was enforced: the Ford silence. Talking, singing, whistling, or humming on the line was strictly prohibited. Imagine that. 10,000 men in a room, and the only sound is the deafening roar of the presses and the screech of metal. It was a tomb of noise. Workers developed a condition known as the Ford face, a frozen, mask-like expression of intense concentration and suppressed exhaustion. They even developed a way to speak without moving their lips, a prison-style ventriloquism known as the Ford whisper, just to maintain a shred of human connection in this forest of steel. But the machine was hungry. As Ford became obsessed with vertical integration, owning everything from the rubber plantations in Brazil to the iron mines in Minnesota, he needed the factory to run seamlessly. The sheer scale of the Rouge was designed to intimidate. The glass plant alone produced enough glass to cover a city. The power plant produced enough electricity to light Detroit. And amidst this gigantism, the individual worker felt incredibly small, disposable, and meaningless. You weren't a man. You were badge number 8940. The danger was constant. The stamping presses, massive jaws of steel that could crush a car body, were fed by hand. Men would lose fingers, hands, sometimes arms. But the line didn't stop for an injury. You were dragged off, a replacement stepped in, and the rhythm continued. The car was the priority. The flesh was secondary. And what were you building? 4 years, it was the Model T, the Tin Lizzie. But as the 1920s roared on, the Model T became obsolete. Chevrolet was making better cars. Ford, stubborn and aging, refused to change. He forced the workers to build an outdated machine faster and faster to keep the price down. The pressure cooked the workforce. The speed-up became unbearable. Men would come home from the Rouge, collapse on the floor, too tired to eat, their hands still shaking from the vibration of the tools. This was the physical colonization of the body. Ford had colonized your home with his inspectors, and now he had colonized your nervous system with his machines. But the most sinister shift was yet to come. As the workers grew more desperate and the threat of unionization began to whisper through the vents of the Rouge, Henry Ford decided that the Sociological Department, the nice investigators who checked your bank accounts, were too soft. He dissolved them. In their place, he built a new organization, an internal army, a secret police force that would make the old inspectors look like kindergarten teachers. He handed the keys to the kingdom to a former Navy boxer, a man with dead eyes and a heart of stone named Harry Bennett. The era of paternalism was over. The era of terror was about to begin. The machines were running hot, the cars were rolling off the line, but the factory was about to become a battlefield. The Rouge wasn't just a factory anymore. It was a fortress, and the war for the worker's mind was shifting from psychological pressure to physical brute force. The golden cage was being reinforced with steel bars, and the man holding the key wasn't the benevolent industrialist anymore. It was the enforcer. May 26, 1927. Mark this date. It is the day the heartbeat of the industrial world stopped. After 19 years and 15 million cars, Henry Ford did the unthinkable. He walked onto the floor of the Highland Park plant, looked at the rolling river of Model Ts, the car that had changed humanity, the car that was the very symbol of his power, and he killed it. The order went out. Stop the line. The silence that followed was louder than any explosion. For nearly 2 decades, the roar of Ford's machinery had been the soundtrack of Detroit, a relentless rhythm of production that never ceased. And suddenly, nothing. This wasn't just a model change. It was an industrial cataclysm. You wanted to hear about the machines? This is the story of the greatest mechanical surgery in history. Ford was losing the war. General Motors and Chevrolet were building cars that were faster, more comfortable, and, most importantly to the consumer and most offensive to Henry Ford, stylish. They had electric starters. They came in colors. The Model T, once the king of the road, was now a dinosaur. It was loud. It was rough. And it only came in Japan black enamel because that specific paint dried faster than any other color, shaving precious seconds off the production time. That is how obsessed Ford was with the machine over the human. He dictated the color of the world based on the drying time of a chemical. But the market had spoken. The T was dead. And now Ford had to build something entirely new, the Model A. But here is the horror of the situation. Ford didn't have a plan. He didn't have a blueprint. He just had an order: destroy the old to build the new. This brings us to the Great Shutdown. This was the ultimate flex of control. To retool for the Model A, Ford didn't just slow down, he fired almost everyone. 60,000 men were thrown onto the streets of Detroit overnight. No severance, no warning, no safety net. The factories, usually teeming with life, became ghost towns of cold steel. Inside the Rouge, however, a mechanical war began. This was engineering at a scale the world had never seen. 40,000 specialized machines, the very bones of the Model T production, were ripped from the concrete floors. Imagine the sound of hydraulic presses being dismantled, the screech of steel on steel as miles of conveyor belts were torn down. They had to rebuild the factory from the inside out while the building was still standing. It was a chaotic, desperate scramble. Henry Ford hated blueprints. He wanted to see the parts. He would walk into the engineering labs, look at a prototype engine part for the new Model A, and simply say, "It looks wrong." And the engineers would have to scrap weeks of work. The pressure was psychotic. The Model A had to be perfect. It needed a new engine, a new transmission, a new electrical system, a new chassis. It needed 5,580 distinct parts, and every single one of them had to be manufactured by a machine that didn't exist yet. The Rouge complex was turned into a hellscape of welding sparks and molten metal. They were building the largest forging hammers in existence. These steam-powered monsters could slam down with tons of force, shaking the ground for miles, shaping the red-hot steel of the new crankshafts. The glass plant was pushed to its breaking point to create the new shatterproof safety glass. A continuous ribbon of molten silica flowing like lava, rolled flat by massive steel drums. The precision required was agonizing. The Model T was loose. You could fix it with a wrench and a hammer. The Model A was a precision machine. The tolerances were microscopic. This meant the workers who were slowly being hired back had to operate with the steady hands of surgeons but at the speed of sprinters. When the factory finally roared back to life months later, it was a different beast. The new assembly line was faster, louder, and more dangerous. The main line at the Rouge was a mesmerizing, terrifying river of creation. The chassis would start at one end, a bare metal skeleton. As it moved, the mechanical ballet began. The rear axle, 4 minutes. The engine mount, 3 minutes. The body drop, 2 minutes. The body of the Model A, painted in the new, scandalous colors like Niagara blue and Arabian sand, would descend from the upper floors on massive chains, swinging over the heads of the workers like a distinct guillotine, before being lowered onto the chassis. The workers had to guide it perfectly into place while the line was still moving. If you missed, you crushed the metal or you crushed your hand. The coordination required was superhuman. And the demand? Insatiable. When the Model A was unveiled, riots broke out. Literal riots. In New York, 50,000 people stormed the showroom just to see it. In Detroit, 100,000. People were trampled. The police were called. It was mass hysteria. The public saw a beautiful, modern machine, a marvel of affordable engineering. But the men inside the Rouge saw something else. They saw the iron horse that had nearly starved them to death during the shutdown and was now working them to the bone to meet the impossible demand of 10,000 cars a day. The Model A was a better car, a masterpiece of mechanical complexity with its sliding gear transmission and four-wheel brakes. But it was built on a foundation of absolute fear. The machines were brand new, shining, and cutting edge, representing the pinnacle of American technology. But the men operating them were old, tired, and terrified. The speed of the new line was dictated by the demand of the public, and Henry Ford, vindicated by the success of his new toy, pushed the throttle all the way down. The factory was no longer just a place of work. It was a high-speed pressure cooker. The gears were grinding, the steam was hissing, the molten metal was pouring, and somewhere in the shadows of this industrial cathedral, the dark enforcers of Harry Bennett were watching, making sure that no human error slowed down the magnificent, hungry birth of the machines. The car was the star, the factory was the stage, and the worker was just a prop that could be replaced if it broke. The success of the model proved one thing to Ford. He could break the system, starve the city, rebuild the world, and everyone would still line up to buy his creation. He had won the battle of the machine, but the war for the factory floor was about to turn violent. The machines were running at maximum capacity. The Model A was a success, but Henry Ford knew that to keep the assembly line moving at this insane, bone-crushing speed, he needed something stronger than just a paycheck. He needed fear, pure, distilled, unadulterated fear. And to manufacture this fear, he didn't turn to an engineer or a manager. He turned to a sailor, a brawler, a man who became the dark prince of the Ford empire, Harry Bennett. If you want to understand the nightmare that the River Rouge became in the 1930s, you have to look at the service department. Sounds harmless, doesn't it? Service, like they are there to fix the plumbing or help you with your paperwork. But in the Ford lexicon, the service department was the Gestapo of the factory floor. It was the largest private intelligence and security force in the world, bigger than the police departments of most major cities. And it was run by Bennett, a man who kept actual lions and tigers in his office as pets, a man who practiced target shooting in his basement while negotiating labor disputes. He was short, bow-legged, and terrifying. Ford, the aging pacifist who hated war, absolutely loved him. Why? Because Bennett did the dirty work that allowed Ford to remain the clean industrialist. Bennett built an army. Literally, he hired over 3,000 men to patrol the factory. But he didn't hire security guards. He hired ex-convicts. He hired boxers. He hired professional wrestlers. He hired gang members from the Detroit underworld who needed a legitimate job. These were men with broken noses and cauliflower ears. Men who knew how to hurt people without leaving a mark. They wore no uniforms. They wore street clothes, blending in, or they wore the signature fedora and trench coat, standing silently in the shadows of the massive stamping presses, watching, just watching. This brings us to the psychological masterstroke of the Bennett regime, the panopticon. You never knew who was watching you. That guy working next to you on the fender line? The one you've been eating lunch with for 3 years? He might be a spy. Bennett estimated that 1 in every 10 Ford workers was an informant. If you grumbled about the speed of the line, if you mentioned the word union, if you even looked at a foreman the wrong way, the servicemen would know before the shift was over. The punishment wasn't a write-up. It was a visit. Sometimes they would just stand behind you while you worked, breathing down your neck, staring at your hands, waiting for a mistake. The psychological weight of that, trying to thread a screw while a 250-pound ex-boxer stares at the back of your head, caused men to break. They would drop tools, they would shake, and then they were fired for inefficiency. It was a system designed to isolate every single human being. You couldn't trust your friends. You couldn't trust your neighbors. You were alone with the machine. The service department men had total authority. They patrolled the aisles of the Rouge like sharks. They had a rule: hit first, talk later. But the genius of Bennett was that he institutionalized this brutality as discipline. They claimed they were protecting the factory from communists and agitators. But in reality, they were protecting the profit margin from the human need for rest. Bennett's power grew so immense that even Henry Ford's own son, Edsel, the president of the company, was terrified of him. Bennett ran the factory like a personal fiefdom from his office in the basement of the administration building, a bunker filled with surveillance reports and weapons. He had tunnels built under the factory to move his men secretly, so they could pop up in any department at any time like demons rising from the earth. The Ford silence became absolute. Men developed a way of communicating with their eyes, a subtle sign language of survival, because speaking the truth was dangerous. The physical toll was horrific, but the mental toll was worse. You were working for the most advanced technological company on Earth, building the symbols of American freedom, yet you were living in a totalitarian state where your job, your safety, and your sanity hung by a thread held by a gangster with a bow tie. The tension in the plant was palpable, thick like the oil smoke in the air. The speed-up continued. The machines got faster. The quota went up. And the servicemen got bolder. They started enforcing rules that made no sense just to prove they could. No sitting. No leaning. No smiling. It was a pressure cooker with the valve welded shut. The Great Depression was ravaging the country outside the gates, making the job inside even more precious, which gave Bennett even more leverage. "You don't like it?" he would say. "There are 10,000 men outside waiting for your badge number." This was the peak of Ford's control, machine dominance enforced by human brutality. But you can only compress a gas so much before it explodes. The workers were pushed to the edge of endurance. The fear was turning into anger. The whisper of union was no longer just a whisper. It was becoming a growl. The UAW, United Auto Workers, was organizing. They were coming for Ford, and Harry Bennett was waiting for them, cracking his knuckles, ready to turn the factory floor into a battlefield. The inevitable collision between the unstoppable force of the labor movement and the immovable object of Henry Ford's ego was about to happen, and it wouldn't be settled with a handshake. It would be settled on the concrete of the overpass in full view of the world. The nightmare was about to step out of the shadows and into the daylight. The pressure inside the Rouge was now critical. The year is 1937. The rest of the auto industry had already surrendered. General Motors had signed with the union. Chrysler had signed. But Henry Ford? Never. He stood like a stone wall, declaring that he would dismantle his factories brick by brick before he let the United Auto Workers tell him how to run his business. To Ford, the union wasn't just a labor organization. It was a personal insult, a virus attacking his perfect organism. But the virus was already inside. Walter Reuther, a brilliant, fiery young organizer, the man Henry Ford came to fear more than anyone else, had a plan. It wasn't a strike. Not yet. It was a test. A psychological probe to see just how far Ford's service department would go. The stage was set for the most famous physical confrontation in labor history, the Battle of the Overpass. May 26, 1937. It was a cool, gray morning. Reuther and a handful of organizers, dressed in their Sunday best suits, walked towards the massive pedestrian overpass at Gate 4 of the River Rouge complex. This bridge was significant. It was the artery that connected the public street to the private kingdom of Ford. Thousands of workers crossed it every day during shift changes. Reuther's plan was simple. Stand on the bridge, hand out leaflets titled "Unionism, not Fordism," and let the workers know they weren't alone. It was entirely legal. The bridge was public property. But in the mind of Harry Bennett, the law stopped at the edge of the Ford property line. As Reuther and his men stepped onto the concrete of the overpass, the trap snapped shut. They weren't met by police. They were met by the goon squad. Bennett had stationed dozens of his toughest enforcers, professional wrestlers, ex-convicts, the heavy hitters, waiting in the shadows of the support beams. What happened next was a masterclass in brutality, but it was also the moment Henry Ford made a fatal miscalculation. He thought this would be just another quiet beatdown in the alley, another lesson taught in the dark. But Reuther had brought a weapon Ford didn't anticipate: the camera. A group of newspaper photographers had followed the Union men. When the thugs advanced, they didn't just attack the organizers. They attacked the press. They shouted, "Smash the cameras!" hoping to destroy the evidence. But they weren't fast enough. As the servicemen lunged, grabbing Reuther and his colleagues, lifting them into the air and slamming them onto the concrete, the shutters clicked. Click, click, click. Those sounds were the death knell of the Ford absolute monarchy. The assault was vicious. Reuther was kicked, punched, and thrown down the stairs. The organizers were dragged by their coats, their faces bloody, their dignity stripped away. It was a public execution of civil rights. The servicemen, drunk on their own power, didn't care who saw. They beat the women organizers who were distributing pamphlets on the street below. They chased the photographers, tearing film out of cameras. But, and this is the key, one photographer, James Kilpatrick of the Detroit News, managed to hide his photographic plates under the back seat of his car before the goons could find them. He sped away with the smoking gun. The next morning, the world didn't just hear rumors of Ford's terror. They saw it. The photos were splashed across the front pages of every major newspaper in America. There was Walter Reuther, bloodied but standing. There were the Ford thugs, faces twisted in rage, looking like gangsters, attacking unarmed men. The image of the benevolent Henry Ford, the man who gave the world the $5 day, was shattered instantly. He wasn't the kindly grandfather of industry anymore. He was the paymaster of a violent militia. The public outrage was immediate and volcanic. The Battle of the Overpass did exactly what Bennett tried to prevent. It galvanized the workers. Inside the plant, the men saw the photos. They saw that the union leaders were willing to bleed for them. The fear that had paralyzed the workforce for a decade began to turn into something else. Solidarity. The Ford silence cracked. Workers began to wear union buttons openly, daring the servicemen to attack them. When a foreman tried to fire a man for wearing a button, the entire department would stop working. The speed-up faltered because the human parts of the machine were finally rebelling. Bennett tried to clamp down harder, firing thousands, but it was like trying to hold back the tide with a spoon. The federal government stepped in. The National Labor Relations Board charged Ford with violating federal law. The Senate commenced hearings. The walls were closing in. Ford was now fighting a war on three fronts: against the union, against the government, and against public opinion. And yet, the old man refused to yield. He screamed at his son Edsel. He threatened to close the plants. He swore he would never sign. But the control was gone. The psychological spell was broken. The camera had revealed the monster in the machine, and once you see the monster, you can no longer pretend it's a savior. The rouge was boiling. The Ford man, that obedient, silent, efficient robot, was dead. The workers were waking up, and they were ready to shut down the largest factory on Earth to get their dignity back. The final showdown wasn't going to be on a bridge. It was going to be a complete standstill of the engines. The unthinkable was about to happen. The giant was going to strike.